Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast. Okay, I promise, absolutely no singing this week. No, I've learnt my lesson. I'll stick to the karaoke, which is actually what somebody said. Yes, we had some very nice comments on the show. And thank you, my first solo show. Me talking about Peggy Guggenheim with the wonderful Mary Dearborn. Thank you for those who listened to it, and thank you for everybody who's listening to us through this summer, this solo summer of Phil. It's amazing to me. We're getting thousands of views every week and listens, mostly of the old shows, I have to say. Although Peggy did pretty well, and thank you for everybody who gave us some nice comments and feedback and likes on that show. Julie Koenig, our old friend, says, "Don't quit your day job, Phil." I think she may be in the singing. Marking time, 10:24. Great choice, and thank you for it. About Peggy. Fred Witherow, yes, Phil, you'd be great on the old karaoke, mate. Susan Werner, 5285. Excellent show. Can't wait to read the book. I love your interviews. Isn't that nice? Isn't that nice? Yes. So we're carrying on, or rather I am. With quite a packed little show today. Several things to talk about. Prince Harry's back. He is. He's all over the TV. And it's another front page story in Britain's press, not just the tabloid press, the serious broadsheet press, looking in detail at what he's saying about hacking and his great crusade to try and get some accountability for what happened 15, 20, 25 years ago to an awful lot of celebrities and royals, including himself, and especially including his mother. Now, we talked about this a lot, and people will probably know that I'm rather sympathetic to Harry on this point. We discussed this with Clive Irving, actually, from the Daily Beast in episode 71, if you're interested. Very much focused on Harry's attempt to get Rupert Murdoch into a court of law, which, as far as I know, has never happened in any case. Of course, News International and the other companies that Murdoch controls, they always settle before Rupert gets into court. So we will see if that's going to happen. But yeah, I am sympathetic. And I do think that one of the deep causes of the rift within the royal family is what happened, not just to Harry when he was with Meghan, but maybe especially long before, in the years just before and immediately after his mother's death, when the press were all over everybody. And there were lots of secret deals done, slightly shabby deals done between members of the royal households and some of the worst tabloid operators. And that's something that I think is provably true. And I think that he's right to keep pursuing it. Anybody who worked in the British media in those days, and I certainly did, and Andrew certainly did, we know that hacking was openly discussed and people were proud of it. You know, people who could get stories, get a foot in the door by any means necessary, going through bins, whatever it took. Those people were kind of lionized. They were the sort of heroes of Fleet Street. It looks bad now to think about that. And it was bad, but nevertheless, that's what it was like. So kind of good luck to Harry, I think, in his continuing battle to get to the bottom of this story. Now, does that mean that I'm on Harry's side, so to speak, when it comes to the great split with William and Kate? No, I don't think it does. I think it's one of the things that gives him some justification for the way he's behaved. But I also think that our friend Valentine Lowe, who's been on here many times, was right about the fissures in the relationship, Meghan's behaviour, that she was a difficult boss, all sorts of things that just grew into a kind of personal rift. And then, of course, I don't think anything really justifies the allegations of racism they've made, especially against Kate and William, or Kate and Charles. You know, that just sounds like something very small and possibly meant really well-intentionally that was hyped up and exaggerated. So no, I'm not Team Harry and Meghan. But when it comes to this story of hacking, I think we should actually be quite excited about the progress that's being made and probably support Harry a bit more than many of us do in what he's doing. So anyway, yep, a right royal mess. And talking of which, Prince Philip, big story again, breaking. FBI files have been discovered. This sort of reminds me of Andrew discovering FBI files about Lord Mountbatten and his sexual life and allegations of him being a predator. And that these files take years to come out, but somebody's got their hands on them. And it looks like in the early 60s, the FBI were looking at Prince Philip And there were suggestions all the way to J. Edgar Hoover that he was connected to the great Profumo scandal, something we've talked about many times, did a whole episode on it early on in the life of this podcast. Profumo, we called it at the time the Everest of scandals, and it really was. It pretty much broke down a government, ministers resigned, there were Soviet spies, sex rings, and there were always allegations that various important people were involved in that affair, but their involvement was covered up. And that one of them was Prince Philip. Now, Prince Philip did know the man Stephen Ward, who was the sort of pimp figure, the man who organized these kind of high-profile sex parties, high society sex parties. Philip did know him. He was in a rather notorious club with him. It was called the Thursday Club. And they moved in similar circles. And Philip, there have been so many rumors about him for so long. He was a man of his time. He was handsome. He was a popular young naval officer. He spent his whole life surrounded by temptation. And the suggestion is he didn't really feel the need to resist that temptation. And also that he didn't feel that giving into the temptation, so to speak, and pursuing secretive affairs would stop him being a good husband, the strength and stay of the Queen. That's just how a lot of upper class marriages worked in those days. Whether you like it or not, whether it's true or not, that is the allegation. And it's always felt like there's been something in it. The Crown, I think, handled it really delicately, but made no secret to the fact that they clearly thought he'd had flings and affairs, especially associated with these kind of drunken dining clubs and these sort of high society parties, and the sort of parties that Ward threw. These files are really quite exciting for those people who've studied Profumo. I can think some quite big writers and authors of famous books about this case will be now thinking about doing extra chapters. And maybe we should do the whole program on it when Andrew returns, because he knows a lot about this too. But basically, American business people and socialites in London fed back information to the FBI that the two young women who were particularly involved in the sex parties, Christine Keeler, Mandy Rice Davis, who one of whom, Keeler, was linked to John Profumo, the leading politician who had to resign, but that also Philip was involved in the parties too. And there's supposedly been evidence of this that was made to disappear, drawings made by Stephen Ward, who drew various scenes from these parties. He quite liked to observe. He was a bit of a voyeur, I think. That was his interest, that was his kink. And there were supposedly these rather racy drawings which featured people up to all kinds of misbehavior, and that one of them was Philip. And that in the aftermath of the affair, and you'll probably know that Stephen Ward ended up killing himself, his flat was very thoroughly cleaned and all sorts of things were made to disappear. And that perhaps included those pictures. I don't know. I also wonder, does it matter? Well, it mattered to US officials, clearly. Relations with the United Kingdom at that stage were rather important. The height of the Cold War, we're talking about the head of state of an allied nation. If J. Edgar Hoover thought it was important, then it probably was. If the Prince Philip was involved in a circle which included not just British politicians, but an actual Russian spy, then he could have been very, very heavily compromised, possibly blackmailed. So yeah, a real national security issue. But I also think, and we have talked about this before, royal history is real history. Gossip can become biography. These people's lives are public. Their relationships affect the culture that we live in, the general morale of the nation. And yeah, I think we deserve to know the truth about them, especially when it comes to writing, proper biographies, authoritative pieces of work, the sort of books that Andrew has written about Mountbatten and the Duke of Windsor. We do need to know what really happened and get access to files. Anybody involved is long since dead now, so I think there's no reason why it should be covered up, even though covering things up does seem to be the default mode still of this great nation of the United Kingdom. Plus, if you didn't think that an interest in the lives of the rich and famous wasn't kind of normal, then what you're doing listening to this podcast, because we do, and we don't make any apologies for it. These things are interesting, and we love to find out more about them. So yeah, that's your big royal update of the week. But I guess all of that pales into insignificance compared to what's been happening in the United States. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump was one of those stories that we will never forget, and we'll always remember where we were when we heard about it. It is a very big deal, and he very nearly got killed. So I'm really pleased that we've persuaded our good friend, Gerald Posner, who's been on the show now twice before, I think, once talking about the scandals of the Vatican and once about assassinations. He's a real expert on political assassinations. He's written countless articles and books, perhaps the greatest book on the Kennedy case. He's also written about Martin Luther King Jr. and the murder of him and the assassination plot. And he's just very well plugged in to the whole process of how these things are investigated and how the conspiracy theories about them can spread. So I'm very keen to find out what he has to say. So I think without further ado, let's go and do that. For the meantime, I'll be back in a couple of weeks. We're doing 2 a month. Now I'll be back in mid-August with the next show. I have no idea what it's about. But something that I find interesting, talking to various people. Thanks for staying with us during my solo summer. Please keep liking and subscribing. Many of you have been doing. Thank you for that. If you're a new arrival, do check out all the old shows. Thanks for your attention. Let's go talk about assassins. Thank you so much for joining me. I should say you've been under a lot of pressure since the assassination attempt. You've been all over CNN and various American networks, but of course they pay you money, but we send you a really nice mug.
So, no, your mug is more than I get from them. I don't get paid anything from the American networks. I wish that would be.
Is that so? Is that is a scandal in and of itself?
Well, you only get paid, or somebody would just consider I was a fool for doing it for nothing. But no, you only get paid if you do a nighttime show, one of those evening shows. So Bill Maher, something like that, where I've been on those, they give you scale for the appearance. But otherwise, for regular shows, you're getting the word out. They're consider that they're doing you a favor by having you on, and I understand that. So any journalist who gets paid, put me in touch with them because I want to know who their agent is.
It's probably Andrew Loney.
I would think that Andrew would set a new standard for everything. That's true.
Well, I'm going to read you back one of your unpaid quotes from one of your interviews yesterday, which I thought would be a good way to start our conversation about the extraordinary events of the last week or so. This is you. You couldn't make this up in a movie, says Mr. Posner. This is the greatest breach and the dropping of the ball that I've ever seen in terms of the Secret Service. Wow.
Yeah, no, it's really terrible. I mean, having studied the Secret Service and presidential security since the Kennedy assassination, through Martin Luther King, through other assassinations of Robert Kennedy, and seen how they reacted with Ronald Reagan. Look, it's a difficult task. You're providing close protection to somebody that might be a target of an assassin who's willing to give up their life. So if you have somebody who's willing to do a suicide job at close range and they get close enough and they pull out a pistol, we've seen in history that that's pretty hard to stop. But in this case, not only was there a shooter with a rifle at a long distance, 100 meters away, on a rooftop with a clear line of sight to the candidate, but it turns out that the wonderful thing about the internet is we get cell phone videos and we see people looking at where the shooter is and identifying him and say, there he is. No, there he is. You see him. He's laying down. Hey, officer. So there's no question about, was there some advance notice? Just 100 meters from where Trump is speaking, where he's allowed to take the stage, people are in something of a ruckus about this fellow who's on the right.
Well, I was thinking of that in terms of your work on Kennedy. I mean, this is like somebody seeing the shooter in the book depository, I don't know, 30 minutes before, an hour before, and doing nothing about it, I guess.
Yeah, no, it is. And so the part that is extremely frustrating here is there's always the possibility that you could have identified and stopped the shooter before they get off one shot. Then one person would be alive right now, the fireman who died, and nobody would have been wounded. It wouldn't have even been an attempted assassination. But the other problem is that there's a protocol inside the Secret Service that when they identify someone who is a suspicious character, they hadn't yet said a suspect or a threat, but they did this at 5:51, about 9 minutes before Trump takes the stage, about 13 minutes before he starts talking. They didn't then tell the Secret Service that we have somebody that we can't locate who we think is a suspicious character, even though other people were locating and pointing to him. Because what should have happened is the immediate command should go out to the Secret Service around the candidate, don't put him on the stage. Until you get an all clear from us, no one goes on the stage. And that wasn't done.
Well, I mean, the director of the Secret Service, I think it was only yesterday, Kimberly Cheadle, had a very uncomfortable time on Capitol Hill. Seems to have a position that she's, I think, shortly going to be relieved of. But it does seem extraordinary that, I don't know whether Biden would have had a better treatment, or is this just the standard of the Secret Service now?
No. Well, first of all, I so seldom get the opportunity on a good podcast to break news. And so Director Cheadle of the Secret Service has resigned just a few minutes ago.
Oh, my goodness.
Hit the wires. Yeah, she submitted her resignation. And after, as you said, her performance, on top of everything else, I had low expectations for her performance yesterday before a congressional committee to which she was subpoenaed. She had to appear. But she appeared and she stonewalled. She didn't answer. She said, I don't know. She tried to hide behind the FBI's investigation. And let me tell you, we are a divided country. In the UK, I understand that the Tories and Labour will go to each other's throat and the Liberal Democrats are there and you've got reform. Well, here, the Republicans and the Democrats are at each other's throat. And this is a particular congressional committee called the Oversight Committee that has a lot of politics involved. And they never agree on the time of day. But yesterday, they were in unison, Democrats and Republicans, in condemning her and asking for her resignation. So it was only a matter of time, but the time ran out today on her. And I'm not surprised that that happened. When you say, would it have been better for Biden and Secret Service protection? I would have said to you a week ago, no, I think it's about the same. But now the question is this. There had been reports that the Secret Service had denied the Trump team's request for extra security. They denied that. The spokesperson for the Secret Service said, not true. Then on Saturday night, the day of the attempted assassination, they suddenly flipped around because 4 anonymous sources speaking to the Washington Post said, by the way, not only did the Secret Service, we know because we have access to the information, we're here, deny extra requests for security and personnel, but it happened over a 2-year period, and some of the requests were in writing. So that's a very interesting thing. Now the new position is, oh yes, that's true, we did do that, but we gave them everything they wanted on the day of the attempted assassination. They weren't short of anything. But it begs the question, were there people as officials in the higher levels of the Secret Service who have, let's say, an animus to Donald Trump? They don't like him. When the FBI investigated Donald Trump, when they were looking at him on the Russia collusion, which turned out to be a big nothing in the end, right? It wasn't accurate. One of the FBI senior people on the investigation, Peter Strzok, had to resign, or he was pushed out because they found emails that he had sent to a girlfriend that said, I hate Trump. He's just a despicable character. Once you show that and you're the investigator, people think you put your thumb on the scale, you're not going to be fair about it. Will there be emails in the upper echelon of the Secret Service from somebody saying, I can't stand that guy, he's just no good? Doesn't mean that there was a conspiracy or that they did anything untoward, but it would look terrible in this political environment.
It really would, wouldn't it? I mean, nobody in the world probably knows more about conspiracy theories around assassinations in America than you. I guess they've already started, have they, on this one?
They have indeed. As a matter of fact, I used to be asked, Phil, what do you think it would be like if the Kennedy assassination happened today in the internet? And I always said, oh, they'd start off on this, the conspiracy theories would start faster and on steroids. And I underestimated how true that was. I mean, they started to come within minutes of the shooting. There was a flood of them, a tsunami within a couple of hours. And influencers, I describe an influencer as somebody on Twitter or TikTok or Instagram who has 1 million followers, 2 million, 5 million. They get videos out there, they shared information that said, oh, we have a sound tape of 2 shooters, and there's a flood. By the way, some of this, even if the Secret Service, the FBI, and the federal government had held press conferences, regular updates about what they knew and what they didn't know, we'd still have a lot of conspiracy theories out there. But there was a vacuum of information because normally there's a hurricane or there's a shooting or there's a tragedy, and we are accustomed in this country to see officials come before the microphone, hold press conferences. They're very careful about what they answer. They say, I can't get into that because we're still investigating it, but here's what we know. There's been none of that. There hasn't been a single press conference by the Secret Service, the FBI, or anyone else. When there's that vacuum of that void of silence, no wonder it's filled with speculation online and fake information. There was a report for a while that made the rounds on X, where I see you and exchange messages with you occasionally, that said, by the way, this woman, and they circled a woman behind Trump who was sort of in a white top. That is an FBI officer in a senior position. They named her. She's taking a video of the assassination. Isn't that suspicious? Well, it turns out it's not that FBI person, who was actually off in California or some such place. But those things get around. People see them. They repeat the information, and it's like you literally being in front of a dike, and the holes are starting to come in, and the water is leaking. You're putting your finger in this one and that one and that one and that one. And it's just too fast to stop all of the fake information.
Well, have you seen anything yet that's made you think that there's more to this than meets the eye, or is it what it looks like, an individual who just wanted to be famous?
Yeah, I don't know yet. So isn't that, I mean, the answer is, anybody who tells you that they have an answer already, you can't. We all have an intuition about what we think happened. So yeah, I think a 20-year-old kid who I wanted to learn a lot more about ended up on a roof shooting at Trump. Now, did he have any assistance in that? Was he encouraged to do that by somebody else? Did somebody else work with him online? I don't know. We think of conspiracies nowadays, meaning like Hollywood conspiracies. It has to be the MI6, MI5, and the FBI and the CIA. But conspiracies can be small, kitchen conspiracies with a handful of people. That's how it was with John Wilkes Booth when he killed Lincoln years ago. That's how James Earl Ray might have killed Martin Luther King with help from his family. So I don't know if he had that assistance. And in terms of the Secret Service, I know that there are individuals who are on the far left. There are two theories that I don't give credence to without yet knowing all the facts. One is the far left's, there's a lot of people who think it was staged. It's a fake attempt. It was Hollywood. There's an astonishing poll, at least astonishing to me, in Newsweek the other day, in which 1 out of 3 Biden supporters on a quick flash poll believed that the assassination was faked, that Trump had done it sort of to win support. Boy, that's pretty amazing. So if that's the case, he found the only assassin I know around who's a 20-year-old kid who can hit the air and not go half an inch over and blow his brains out. But that aside. And then on the far right, you have a lot of people who say, look at this, what appears to be gross negligence on the part of the Secret Service. It must be intentional. They must have set him up. They must have done all of that so it was possible to do. And I don't see the evidence for that. But look, as an investigator, you go into it with your eyes open, you follow the evidence, and then you reach your conclusions. People may not like the conclusions you reach. So if in a year, 6 months, whenever, I say, by the way, I just think it was a 20-year-old kid shooting at Trump without a conspiracy, people say, oh, you always felt like that. No, it's really not true. I'd love to find a bigger story. I'd love to come back with a story that wins me a Pulitzer Prize by saying I found the real cabal that turned out to turn this into a major conspiracy. It would be a big story.
We tend to focus on the failures of protection and the authorities in these matters. But of course, you know better than anybody, for the assassin himself, and it's usually a him, an awful lot has to go right. It's quite difficult to kill somebody as famous and as well protected as the President of the United States. Do you get a sense that this guy's been thinking about this and planning it for a long, long time? Or can these things happen really quickly and really randomly?
Well, I mean, sometimes it can happen quickly and rapidly. A Squeaky Frommel was a Charles Manson follower, went and tried to shoot at Gerald Ford. She didn't get the shot off at the spur of the moment. She found out he was going to be in San Francisco. So that was pretty much a last-minute thing. Believe it or not, Lee Harvey Oswald, who I'm convinced killed Jack Kennedy, only found out that the motorcade of the president was going in front of the place where he worked 2 days before the assassination took place. So that's pretty much late planning. Now, the Trump rally was announced on July 3rd, took place on the 13th. So the kid would have had, Crooks, the shooter, 10 days, if that was in the back of his mind, of thinking of doing something. That's a fairly long time. Now, what is remarkable to me about that, as opposed to be the last minute and all of a sudden he just ran out the field and looked around for a place to get, he had gone there a couple of times before, according to the reports, according to sources who have talked to senators. He even had a drone which went over the field. But interesting, the Secret Service did not deploy a drone to keep an eye on all the rooftops.
That's astonishing.
It is astonishing to see what the layout looked like. he might well have found the 2 or 3 spots that he felt were comfortable for a shot. We tend to think in terms of assassinations. You said a moment ago, everything has to break right for the assassin, and you're right. So people think that if somehow there had been a team, a sniper, a Secret Service agent on the roof of that building, that would be the end of the attempted assassination. No, not necessarily. It just means that the shooter, who was looked for where to shoot from, that was his first choice, clearly, because it's where he ended up. But if there was security on top of the building, he might have looked for another location. He might have had another location to shoot from that wasn't as clear a line of shot, that was a little bit lower. He might still have tried it. And if he couldn't find any place to shoot from, I believe, I can't say this because I found it in evidence yet, but understanding assassins as I do, or want to be assassins, he would have taken his rifle home, and that would have been the end of it. It wasn't a suicide mission like an Islamic terror attack in which the person was determined to blow themselves up no matter what. And I think that we forget about that because clearly the same with Oswald, who was shooting from the 6th floor of the building that he worked at Jack Kennedy. He was left alone on that 6th floor of the building by all his coworkers who went down for lunch about half an hour earlier. Let's assume they hadn't gone for lunch. If they had stayed up there, he wasn't going to try to take the rifle out in front of them and shoot at Kennedy. He would have gone to another location in the building where nobody was able to find him. And if he couldn't find one of those, he might have gone home. Now, that drives people crazy to think that the difference between an assassination or not could be little bits of breaks along the day, but it's like the perfect storm. Everything has to break right for the assassin to be able to pull it off.
You mentioned that British political culture, which actually isn't always cups of tea and games of cricket, it can get pretty tough. But certainly compared to what we see in America these days, it seems fairly polite. You mentioned that, but is it fair to say that political violence has always been one of America's great problems, and maybe the assassination of the candidate is one of the defining images of America and has been for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, sort of, hate to have to agree with that. Hate to have to agree with it, not because it's wrong, but it is a feature. The Archduke and Hungarians, and that was a long time ago. I understand that, and occasionally we get a South American presidential candidate who gets stabbed. It's happened recently, right? And occasionally somebody wants to take a pot shot at Erdogan, and and they get foiled before they get there. But for the most part, we do have this history in which we've had presidents assassinated. And we've had public leaders assassinated. People forget how close Ronald Reagan came in 1980 to dying, a couple of inches over on that bullet that John Hinckley fired into his chest. Reagan was dead. It would have hit his heart, and that was the end of him. That's often the difference in these assassinations. And by the way, as a sidelight, the director of the Secret Service in 1980, a Republican who had been appointed, when that attempted assassination took place, he resigned. He thought he had failed in his. So pretty interesting that he set that standard back then.
Well, actually, I did think of Hinckley when we talked about this guy, because maybe there's a similarity there, that this is a personal mission. This is something a little bit idiosyncratic rather than a big political or extremism.
So somebody said to me the other day, "Well, we'll never know because he's dead. Like Oswald, he's dead." And I said, "Well, just because assassins live, we don't necessarily get a better idea of why they did it." James Earl Ray, who killed Martin Luther King, lived for decades afterwards and kept spinning wild stories that were demonstrably false about how he was led into doing the killing. We learned nothing about why he really killed King. The same thing happened with Sirhan Sirhan, the young Palestinian who killed Bobby Kennedy in 1968. Said, I don't remember anything, and has sort of kept that for all these years. So when they live, we don't find out. But in instances, it is rather interesting that the only person we have a clear motive for, without any doubt at all, is the one person deemed by the American court system as legally insane, John Hinckley. He did describe wanting to kill Reagan to impress Jodie Foster, and we all believe that that is the case. And sometimes I know people in general, I'm going to make a great overgeneralization here, hate or dislike or want to dismiss these manifestos, as they are often called, left behind by a shooter. And they're rambling. They don't always tell us the why. But in some cases, like the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, left a rather remarkable anti-technology screed, and it really told you why he did it. It doesn't mean that you then say, oh, you did the right thing. You think that's an abominable and terrible thing you did, but now I understand what motivated you. So we don't know yet what will be found in the shooter's online material, in anything that he left behind. It's one of the frustrations that we haven't had a briefing to tell us if there's anything at all.
Where do you think this leaves, well, the Secret Service, but also the election campaign?
Boy, I'll tell you, I always say that you can't predict politics 2 months in advance, much less 4 months in advance, and much less on this topsy-turvy year. So it's hard to figure. If you had asked me before the first presidential debate, if we had had a podcast and you said, by the way, you think Joe Biden is going to drop out? I would have said, you're insane. It's absolutely not going to happen. There's not a chance. He's running as hard as ever, and it's going to be a very close race. So the fact that the race has been turned upside down, the age issue is lost. It's not used anymore against the Democrats, no matter what. It'll be used against Trump instead. They'll say he's 77, or he's going to be 81. We can't have an old person there in the office. That's politics. And I think it's going to be a very close election. I see a lot of commentators saying, oh, the Republicans have it locked up. And I'm just not convinced. I think that in the end, this country is split 50-50 in many ways. The elections are remarkably close. In the last election, a lot of people may forget in the UK that Joe Biden got more popular votes than any candidate in American history. And Donald Trump, who lost that election, got the second largest number of popular votes in American history. Wow. So a lot of people came out to vote for both of them. And then we have the odd electoral college system. So I get it. And, I would like to give you a firm answer, and then you could come back to me the day after the election and say, Posner, you predicted it. But I don't have a prediction in hand that I can figure out.
Do you think the campaign will be different? Will politicians be as exposed to the public as they would normally? Less kissing of babies, more hiding behind perspex screens. Will it be like that?
You would tend to think so, although I think that runs against Trump's DNA. So the very idea, you think of Trump after that shot has missed, and you could be a little bit in shock. There's all the chaos around you in that. And his character pretty much shows it. He stands up and he's pumping his fist to the crowd and yelling, fight on. So I can't imagine advisors being able to convince him you should take a lower profile. He'll still mix it up and get out there. And that, of course, is going to be a risk for the public, and no question about that. It's a campaign that I think we'll see the candidates up front and close, and you always worry about a copycat. There's no doubt. That's the nature of violence. Sometimes something takes place. One particularly bad American habit is school shootings, as you know all too well. A school shooting takes place, and then sometimes you get another one 10 days later, or something else. Some kid who's already on the edge has been thinking about how happy he or she is in their life, and they've been bullied and they're not happy and everything else. And then they see this take place and they say, hey, you know what? That's what I'm going to do.
Well, look, I know you need to get to your other unpaid work. Incidentally, now I know nobody else pays you. I'm going to send you an invoice for that mug. I'm sorry, you're going to have to pay.
Yeah, no, send me the invoice. I have a whole drawer of unpaid invoices. I intend to one day expire with that drawer of unpaid invoices. It's just booming over.
No, it's great. It is so good of you to find the time to talk it through. I want to ask you one final question, which is a bit broader, I guess, than just the assassination. I'm not a great fan of Donald Trump, and people who've heard this podcast will have heard me talking about this before. But I found the whole persecution of him in the court distasteful. I did. It just felt wrong. It felt like people were running to get elected so they could change the law, so they could get somebody that everybody hated. And that, to me, I don't know whether it's in any way connected to what happened in this rally, but there's something poisonous in the system on both sides, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Look, we have seen what we used to call banana republics. I guess you can't say that. It's probably not politically correct anymore, in which the judicial system would be used against an enemy. The state would use that against it. And the charges that have been brought against Trump in 4 potential cases, there's one on sort of classified documents. That's probably the most serious of the group, and one that could actually carry some weight, but it's not going to be heard before the election. And that's just not going to get there. The weakest of the 4 cases was actually this case that was finally brought to trial in New York. And you're right, the Attorney General of the state Tisha James, and the district attorney in New York, Bragg, had run on a platform of "We'll get Trump," which is really rather amazing, And in New York, that worked very well. 75% of the vote in Manhattan, where the trial took place, went for Biden. There's little love for Trump. And I looked at it as a lawyer. I'm a non-practicing lawyer, but I have a legal eye on it. I said to Tricia, my wife at the time, it's such a weak case because they had to sort of invent the ability to bring felonies after the fact because the statute of limitations had run. And it's on a very, very precarious, thesis here. I think it will be a hung jury. In America, you need a unanimous 12 people to agree on it. And she said to me from the get-go, I don't think so, because no one, there's a lawyer on there, there's a accountant, no one wants to go back to their place of business in Manhattan and say, I was the person that hung the jury. I was the person that refused to convict Trump, because the general feeling from progressives was, Trump, that may not have been the best case, but he's done so many other things. You know what? He still deserved it. It inflamed his base. It made them more passionate. It gave the Democrats and the Biden-Harris team, and now Harris, the ability to refer to him as a convicted felon. There had even been a resolution in Congress, which didn't go anywhere, that you could not get Secret Service protection if you were convicted of a felony. That was directed clearly at Trump, but it didn't happen. So I think there's too much rancor in the system on both sides. And when I say on both sides, there had been an impeachment resolution introduced in the House against Biden, because I forget what the basis even of it was, some tangential thing of he didn't protect the border or that. I would hope right now that will be dropped. That would be the decent thing to do automatically. But in this environment, I don't know if it is, because both sides overplay their hand. And the worst overplay, if I can say in this long last answer, I'm sorry about that. I wrote a piece the other day in the Wall Street Journal in which I talked about the effect of hateful rhetoric of that. I don't mean to say there's a direct line between what somebody says and then you have an assassin go out there. But in America, and probably abroad, I've seen it in a Stern magazine as well, there have been a lot of references to Trump as the next Hitler. He is the new Hitler. He's an existential threat to democracy. And they've also referred to him as, along the way as Putin and Kim Jong-un, and I get that. But Hitler's and not just by some political extremists on X, it's been on the cover of the New Republic just in their June issue. They had a 1932 political poster of Hitler and they morphed into Trump. It's been on MSNBC host who's very, very popular said just a week before the shooting, just tell me who to vote for so I can stop Hitler getting in. President Biden himself had compared the rhetoric of Trump to Hitler. And there was an article in Politico last December that said, look, comparing a political candidate to Hitler is pretty inflammatory, but the Biden administration has given the green light to surrogates and people speaking for it on the campaign to do so. Now, the problem with that is we would all take a time machine back if we could kill the young Hitler. If you could stop what was going to happen in World War II, you would do it. So even people on TikTok who don't know much about history know Hitler is a bad guy. And if you keep saying that enough in positions of authority, you could have a kid who's already on the edge and push him over the edge to think he's really going to do the right thing for history. So people come back to me, by the way, Phil, and say, well, I do think he's an odious, terrible, fascist guy. So I said, make your case. Then argue your case as to why you think that. But without the easy, cheap Hitler comparison, it's not going to change everything. But I think that we were hearing that drumbeat of he's the next Hitler so many times from people of authority. And I do think we'll hear that much less in the next 4 months.
Well, I hope you're right. I think you probably are, actually. But I'm not sure it'll make a huge difference in the long term. I hope it does. So nice to talk to you. And I really appreciate this sort of a quick reaction emergency interview amongst your many others. And thank you so much for all your insights.
No, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure.
See you very, very soon.
And we should talk after the election, and then I can tell you that's exactly what I thought would happen.
Of course you will.
All right.
All the best.
Thank you. Bye.
I will tell everybody to buy your books, which we will put on the website. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.